The man known to history as Mao Zedong, or Chairman Mao, was born on the 26th of December 1893 in the village of Shaoshan in the province of Hunan in southern China. His father was Mao Chiang, who had been raised in a family of poverty-stricken peasants. However, after serving in the Chiang army for a few years in his youth, Chiang had returned to his native region and begun working as a farmer. He soon acquired enough money to become a lender in the district, and this, combined with his agricultural work, allowed him to become one of the more prosperous farmers in the Shaoshan area, eventually coming into possession of about 20 acres of land. Mao's mother was Wen Qimei, a devout Buddhist who had a troubled upbringing. Her father was a poor shoemaker who drank heavily, and her mother had been his concubine. Mao's childhood was less than ideal. His father was a strict disciplinarian whose method of parenting primarily involved beating Mao and his 3 siblings if they did not do as they were told. Their mother tried to temper his outbursts, but with little effect. Young Mao developed an interest in his mother's Buddhism when he was younger, though he soon became disenchanted with religion, and when he was just 8 years old, he was sent to the local primary school in Shaoshan. Just as the 20th century was dawning, his education there was a mixture of traditional Chinese learning centered on Confucianism combined with the centuries-old values of the Far East, along with a sprinkling of influences from the encroaching Western world which could not be avoided in China by the 1900s. Additionally, the young Mao developed an interest early on in history and politics. When he was 13 years old, his father arranged for him to be married to Liu Yixiu, the 17-year-old daughter of another prosperous local farmer. But Mao demonstrated his rebellious streak at a young age and refused to honor the arranged marriage, causing something of a controversy in the Shaoshan area. And as a result of this disagreement, the teenage Mao temporarily left his father's farm, although he returned before very long. Mao was growing up at a time when China was experiencing momentous change. Like Korea and Japan to the east, China had first come into contact with European traders and religious missionaries in the 16th and early 17th centuries. And like them, the Chinese had quickly become wary of the newcomers and had restricted their contacts with them to 1 or 2 ports in the southeast of the country, where a tiny amount of trade was conducted. It continued like this for nearly 2 centuries, with China remaining largely closed to a world which was modernizing without it. It remained highly conservative in its religious, social and political values, changing little and continuing to be ruled by an emperor and a closed government of imperial rituals and administrators as it had been for centuries. But by the mid-19th century, China again, like Japan and Korea, could no longer prevent the Europeans, with their modern warships, guns and industrial power, from interfering in their countries. With the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, Britain forced China to end its self-imposed isolation, following which China experienced a flood of European contact, and with it came not just British opium, but ideas about different types of government, new economic developments, and all manner of technological innovation. Perhaps the most striking and revolutionary of these new ideas, which arrived into China from the mid-19th century onwards, was the knowledge that the Europeans and the Americans were not ruled by powerful monarchs and emperors anymore. Many lived under republics governed by the people, and even where some of these countries still had emperors or empresses such as Queen Victoria in Britain, she was essentially a figurehead, and it was Parliament that actually ruled the British Empire. Moreover, these democracies were not all alike. Some were very conservative, some were more liberal, and some had different degrees of economic development. And there were also competing ideas about how they should be reformed and developed, with some wanting the wealthy to hold a great amount of power, and others who believed that power and wealth should be distributed equally throughout society. And there were more extreme ideas again. One of these, developed in particular by the German political scientist Karl Marx in the mid-19th century, argued that all wealth and goods should be held in communal ownership. He called this communism. In early 20th century China, these ideas would soon lead to great change, as many began questioning why they were still ruled by the emperor of the nearly 300-year-old Qing dynasty. As Mao entered his teenage years, he was already reading about these political ideas. He was particularly interested in calls for a democracy to be established in China to replace the imperial government, and also the republican writings of Sun Yat-sen, who had become a figurehead for the republican movement within China. He would soon see these desires confirmed. Just as Mao was starting at a new school in Changsha, the country was entering into a period of rapid change. Regional famines had struck parts of China in the late 1900s and early 1910s, and this, combined with numerous regional uprisings throughout the country and growing calls for a more representative government, led to an army revolt in October 1911. At first, the imperial government of Emperor Puyi, who was just a 6-year-old child, tried to address the grievances of the dissenters, but it soon became apparent that a more drastic shift would be necessary. After weeks of negotiations, it was determined in February 1912 that the emperor would abdicate and a new Republic of China would be established, with the imperial officer Yuan Shikai serving as its first president of a national government. Thus, an empire which had been in existence for centuries had ended. It was, however, very unclear in the mid-1910s exactly in what direction China's politics would now head. These were striking developments, and ones which Mao had not been entirely removed from. When the conflict erupted late in 1911, he had enlisted in the rebel army as an 18-year-old recruit. Now, in the spring of 1912, he simply returned to school, and it was around this time that he first started reading about the idea of socialism and communism as more radical forms of government. Yet he remained unconvinced that this was the best approach for China at that time. Meanwhile, his education continued. He determined at some point around 1913 that he would become a teacher, and so he enrolled in the first normal school of Hunan, widely regarded at the time as the best in the province. Here he became a popular and accomplished student, reading widely, being elected secretary of the student society, and eventually finishing as one of the highest-ranked students in the school. More pivotally, in terms of his later activities, Mao was increasingly exposed to the socialist ideas he had first encountered a few years earlier, and over time he began to find that he agreed more with what he read, particularly so as the environment of the first normal school was one of radical political thought, especially during China's first forays into representative government. In 1917, Mao moved to Peking, now Beijing, where one of his main influences at this time, Yang Changji, had taken a job at the Peking University. Here, Mao also took a job as a library assistant, but he was increasingly moving in circles of individuals who favored socialism and communism or Marxism as a solution to China's political woes. Even with the establishment of the Republic in 1912, the country had continued to experience turbulence as conservative and liberal forces fought amongst each other, and regional warlords and power groups exercised quasi-regional independence throughout the country. Marxism appealed to many at this time because the Bolsheviks, a branch of Russian communism, had secured control of the Russian government in the autumn of 1917, just months after the fall of the autocratic Tsarist government there. Perhaps, many thought, communism was also suitable for China, which had just done away with its own fossilized autocratic imperial government. Mao was increasingly leaning towards that viewpoint himself in 1918 and 1919, an outlook which was compounded when he experienced the bourgeois hostility of the Beijing upper and middle class towards a country boy like himself. It was in Beijing that Mao's awakening as a political radical fully occurred. China was drifting ever further into political anarchy in the late 1910s as a buoyant nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen sought to rejuvenate the republic in its infancy, which the nationalists perceived as being governed by a weak, conservative regime with too many links to the old imperial past. In parts of the country, the government could exercise its authority, but in others it was little more than a government in name only. This instability was augmented when the Chinese government failed to secure the former German concession of Shandong at the Versailles peace negotiations in Paris Following the end of the First World War, the nationalists considered it an affront to national pride when this piece of mainland China was instead granted to Japan, a nation which had been exercising its strength across East Asia since the late 19th century, when it had modernized in a far more successful manner than China. And the Shandong controversy was a direct cause of a major student protest which occurred in Beijing on the 4th of May 1919. This was driven by a younger generation of political activists like Mao, who were tired of China's seeming impotence on the world stage and disordered internal politics. The movement would continue afterwards and lead indirectly to the Chinese Civil War many years later. The May 4th movement, the awakening of China's younger generations to radical politics, is generally seen as the origins of the Communist Party of China. The events of 1919 led many young Chinese people who were interested in politics to increasingly turn their backs on the Western liberals of Britain, France, and America who had betrayed them on Shandong, and increasingly to turn towards the Marxism and Leninism that was gradually winning the Russian Civil War and cementing its control over Russia. As we have seen, Mao was already interested in communism by 1919, but it was only in the months following the May 4th protests that he began to fully commit himself to it. And that summer, he organized several student organizations into an umbrella body to protest against the Japanese presence in Shandong. This is the first clear sign of his abilities as an organizer, and his writings around this time and into 1920 began to speak of the Army of the Red Flag and to the victories won by the communists in Russia. By the time that the Communist Party of China was formally established in the summer of 1921, Mao had proclaimed himself to be a communist, believing that the ideology would be the basis for the coming revolution in China. It would be a slow ascent towards that revolution, however. In the meantime, Mao married again in 1920 to Yang Kai-hui, the daughter of one of his former teachers. Then, in July 1921, he attended the first Congress of the Communist Party of China. A decision was taken early on by the new party to accept aid from Russia, but also to establish an alliance with Sun Yat-sen's nationalist party, the Kuomintang, which would soon be led by a younger nationalist by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. Mao was one of the first of the Chinese communists to also join the Nationalist Party, in the belief that the conservative Chinese political establishment would only be overthrown if the nationalists and the communists worked in league with each other. As such, he spent much of the 1920s living in the nationalist stronghold of Guangzhou province and working as an organizer and propagandist for both the communists and the nationalists simultaneously. And throughout this period, Mao was gaining a greater appreciation of the struggles of the Chinese peasantry throughout the country and the strength in sheer numbers which they had if they were won over to the communist cause. As such, the early and mid-1920s were formative, if somewhat unremarkable years in Mao's career. This all began to change in 1926. With the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek had taken over the leadership of the nationalists. By this time, his party, the Kuomintang, had control over large parts of southern China, but the country was still highly fragmented, with the conservative government of the Republic holding Beijing and much of the north, and quasi-independent Chinese warlords who were vestiges of the imperial past holding other parts of the country. In 1926, Chiang determined to force the issue and launched a nationalist military campaign to seize Beijing. The Northern Expedition, as it has become known, was a major success, and during the course of 1926 and 1927, the nationalists seized power in many of the major cities. But the very success of the Northern Expedition also led to civil war. Now, the loose alliance, which the Chinese communists and the nationalists had been in since 1921, was effectively ended by Chiang Kai-shek, who had grown wary of the expanding power of the communists and the role Russia wished to play in China. Once the conservative regime in Beijing was done away with, the result was a split itself within the Nationalist Party in 1927, between Chiang's right-leaning nationalists and a left-leaning faction which wished to accommodate the communists. These events are typically seen as the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which would last for over 20 years. In the summer of 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's newly ascendant Kuomintang began a crackdown on communists throughout China. Thousands were killed, and the party was suppressed in many places. Mao's reaction to this major setback and the inception of civil war between the nationalists and the communists was to retreat with several hundred followers into the wilderness around the Jinggang Mountains on the border of Hunan province. It was the beginning of a long period of guerrilla warfare during which the Communist Party, with tacit aid from Russia, sought to disrupt the rule of the nationalists in anticipation of mass urban revolts by workers throughout the country against the new government. These were often tough years for Mao. His wife and sister were beheaded by the nationalists in 1930, though in his new life as a guerrilla fighter in rural China, he had formed a relationship with He Zedong, whom he married soon after Yang Kai-hui was killed. It was also around this time that he determined on a new course. Instead of waiting for a revolt of the Chinese urban proletariat, he would attempt the same strategy as had brought the Chinese nationalists to power, building up a territory which he would control and expand outwards. In February 1930, Mao, who by now was one of the senior commanders of the Chinese Communist movement, established the Southwest Jiangxi Provincial Soviet government in Jiangxi province. Although the nationalists controlled most of the country, for a few years here in the early 1930s, Mao established a Chinese Soviet state in Jiangxi, with him serving as the chairman. The Red Army had also expanded and was now under the overall control of Zhou Enlai, with the wider Chinese Communist Party focusing attentions on Jiangxi as a safe base for them in the early 1930s. Indeed, Mao, Enlai, and the Red Army saw off several efforts by Chiang Kai-shek to wrest control of the province back from them in the early 1930s by encircling Jiangxi. However, this military response was limited by the nationalists, in part because it had found itself embroiled in a conflict on the other side of China in the early 1930s, as the Empire of Japan invaded the northeastern Chinese provinces of Manchuria and established a puppet state called Manchukuo there. It was just the beginning of heightened Japanese involvement in China in the 1930s, but once the initial furore concerning Manchuria died down, Chiang set his sights on finally reclaiming Jiangxi province from Mao and the communists in the mid-1930s. In September 1933, the Chinese nationalists began the fifth encirclement of Mao and the communists in Jiangxi province. This effectively involved an enormous siege by the nationalists, and one which would prove too large for the Red Army to repulse. By the summer of 1934, it was clear that Mao and his followers would either have to surrender or break out of the besieged area. They chose the latter, and the resulting events have become part of Communist Party law. In October 1934, Communist forces consisting of 86,000 troops, 15,000 personnel, and 35 women broke through nationalist enemy lines and began an epic retreat from their encircled headquarters in southwest China. The Long March, as it became known, lasted 368 days and covered 6,000 miles. They crossed 24 rivers and 18 mountain ranges. Weapons and supplies were borne on the backs of fighters or in horse-drawn carts, and at times the line of marchers stretched for 50 miles. Only 4,000 troops completed the journey. Enduring starvation, aerial bombardment, and almost daily skirmishes with nationalist forces, Mao eventually halted his columns at the foot of the Great Wall of China. The Long March is regarded as the longest continuous march in the history of warfare and marked the emergence of Mao Zedong as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communists. The months after the Long March saw a curious drift in Chinese politics towards a rapprochement between the Communists and the Nationalists. For years, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had been dealing with problems on multiple fronts. As well as the Communists, there was the perhaps greater problem posed by the Empire of Japan and its ambitions to dominate the Far East politically and militarily. This had already resulted in the invasion of Manchuria and the establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo in the early 1930s, But as the years went by, it was clear that the emperor's government in Tokyo had ambitions for an even greater land grab in China. Accordingly, many within the nationalist movement believed it would be best to put aside their differences with the communists for the foreseeable future and form a coherent opposition to the impending Japanese attack. And for their part, Mao and his followers were encouraged to do the same by Moscow. Thus, during the course of 1935 and 1936, Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists were once again drifting towards an alliance of convenience. The drive towards doing so was accelerated in July 1937 when the Japanese again invaded China and proceeded to militarily occupy many of the major cities along its eastern coast, massacring tens of thousands of Chinese civilians in cities such as Nanjing in the process. The Chinese Civil War now morphed into the Second Sino-Japanese War, and in turn, that would become a constituent part of the Second World War in later years. By the end of 1937, the communists and the nationalists were formally allied with each other again after Chiang Kai-shek caved in to pressure to do so from within his own ranks. And Mao also married again around this time to Jiang Qing, an actress who would become his fourth and final wife. As an example of his growing ruthlessness, his former wife He Zedong was packed off to the Soviet Union, where she was placed in a mental asylum. Meanwhile, the nature of the struggle against Japan, which would play out for the next several years, was beginning to become clear. The nationalists moved inland towards central China as the Japanese occupied the rich cities and farmland of the coastal regions of eastern China. Here, in the inland provinces, the nationalists and the communists would wage a war of attrition with the Japanese to the east for the next few years. And these were significant years in terms of the support Mao and the communists enjoyed. In the course of the late 1930s and early 1940s, Mao's Red Army ballooned in size from approximately 50,000 to nearly 500,000 fighters. Thus, the war with Japan was finally creating the kind of countrywide support for the Communist Party which Mao and the other leaders had failed to acquire in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Already by 1940, there were signs of Mao's communists being able to win considerable victories against the Japanese occupation forces. During a campaign which became known as the 100 Regiments Campaign in August 1940, the 400,000-strong Red Army moved against the Japanese in simultaneous attacks against 5 of the coastal provinces, attacks which resulted in the deaths of upwards of 20,000 Japanese troops, as well as a severe disruption to Japanese supply routes. Late 1941 and early 1942 brought setbacks, although the Japanese made a series of sweeping conquests across the Western Pacific, notably seizing Singapore and Burma from the British and the Philippines from the United States, following the declaration of war on the US in December, with the surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. While these conquests initially put the Japanese in the ascendancy in Eastern Asia, the entry of Japan into the wider Second World War also ensured that the nationalists and the communists now had allies in the shape of the British and Americans. With increased military, financial and logistical support being received, they were able to ensure that the Japanese occupation of eastern China was never comfortable during the Second World War. As the war was grinding onwards throughout the first half of the 1940s, the Chinese Communist Party continued to grow in power, and so did Mao as its leader. The nature of the war of resistance against the Japanese favored the communists over the nationalists. For starters, the communists were more attuned to how to wage guerrilla war, having done so for many years against the nationalist government in the late 1920s and early 1930s. As a consequence, they were better prepared for doing so against the Japanese, and as they won a series of victories against the Japanese, the Red Army became the more attractive option for Chinese people seeking to oppose the foreign occupation. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang seemed to many to simply be the Chinese manifestation of the right-wing movements which had brought Japan into China to begin with. And as the Chinese Communist Party, or CPC, expanded in size, Mao also consolidated his control. In 1943, he acquired the chairmanship of both the party secretariat and the Politburo of the party for the first time. It was also during these war years that he began affirming that Chinese communism would have a distinctly different shape than that which had developed in Russia. Beijing would be no puppet of Moscow in future years. We would like to thank our sponsor, Atlas VPN. They offer the best VPN deal on the market. Atlas's virtual private network encrypts all your internet traffic, protecting you, your data, and hiding all your online activities. When you browse online, your location as well as your data is open to attack. But Atlas VPN works with all your devices to encrypt your location as well as all the data you send and receive, which means you can surf the internet safe in the knowledge that no one knows who or where you are. With Atlas VPN, you can get cheaper flights and bookings, as well as cheaper subscriptions online. You can unlock new content from a wide range of services, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Disney+, and more. But Atlas VPN doesn't only allow you to watch your favorite TV shows and movies. It also acts as an ad blocker, blocking malicious links, ads, and trackers. It also notifies you when someone tries to steal your data by tracking data breaches related to your online accounts. So, browse the web incognito by downloading Atlas VPN today. And now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount. It means you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below. The nature of the war against the Japanese changed from 1943 onwards, as Japan suffered a series of severe setbacks in its struggle against the United States, while its European allies, Germany and Italy, were also fighting an increasingly doomed war against Russia, Britain and the US. Once the Allies were victorious there, all their resources would be employed against the Empire of Japan. Consequently, in the final years of the war, thoughts once again turned to China's politics and who would hold power once the country had been freed from the Japanese. As early as 1940, there were serious cracks in the alliance between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, and by 1942, open fighting between the two had broken out yet again as the Chinese Civil War resumed. It would fully erupt again following the end of the Pacific War. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, which Japan had occupied all the way back in 1931. As a result, within weeks, the Empire of Japan had formally surrendered to the Allies. The Second World War was over, and the Chinese Civil War once more commenced between the nationalists and Mao's communists. Mao was in a far more advantageous position in 1945 than he had been 10 years earlier after the Long March. If the Long March had kept the Chinese Communist movement alive, then the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and the 8 years of war with Japan allowed the Communists to strengthen their position immensely. In a curious twist of history, the Japanese invasion of China indirectly led to the Communists seizing power in the country. Early in 1946, Mao was handed an extra advantage when Stalin handed over Manchuria to the Chinese Communist Party. Yet it would take 3 years of further intense fighting between the Communists and the Nationalists before a breakthrough was made. In September 1948, the Communists secured full control of east-central China in the region south of Beijing with the capture of Shandong province in the Huaihai campaign. Then, in the winter of 1948, Mao launched the Pingjin campaign against Chiang Kai-shek's forces in northern China. Over a 2-month campaign, over 500,000 nationalist troops were killed, captured or wounded, and the north of the country was left in communist hands. With northern China largely secured by early 1949, Mao and the Red Army commanders took the decision that spring to drive south of the Yangtze River into the heartland of nationalist-held territory. This was done despite the efforts of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to encourage Mao to form a coalition government with the nationalists. Stalin did not want a rival for power amongst the communist leaders, but he would soon have one. On the 23rd of April 1949, the Red Army seized the nationalist capital of Nanjing. A series of further striking gains saw Chiang Kai-shek retreat south with his remaining supporters to Guangzhou by the autumn of 1949. Just weeks later, he and the remaining nationalists decided to make a strategic retreat from the Chinese mainland to the island of Formosa, more commonly known today as Taiwan. Here, the nationalists formed a government which they proclaimed as the continuation of the Republic of China, which had been established back in 1911. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, Mao had proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949. The Chinese Civil War between the communists and the nationalists was at an end, after more than 20 years of conflict. Mao now entered office as the first chairman of the Central People's Government. The first measure to be taken was to tidy up the loose ends of the war. In the spring of 1950, the Red Army launched a campaign against the island of Hainan off the southeast coast of China. Within weeks, the 100,000-strong nationalist forces there were forced to surrender. The international community now expected that Mao would proceed with an invasion of Taiwan, and indeed, even the American government, a longtime supporter of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, had decided not to recognize his new regime in Taiwan in the belief that it would soon be defeated by Mao and the communists. But no invasion came, and despite numerous crises between the two sides, Taiwan remains self-governing to this day. And this period immediately after the conclusion of the Civil War also saw Mao head to Moscow in the winter of 1949 to 1950. Here he secured large injections of Russian financial support for China, as well as technological advisors, although the agreement came with a tacit admission by Mao of Stalin's primacy within the communist world. Mao would have to wait several years before he could attempt to go his own way. The post-war years in China saw the initiation of wide-ranging political, social, and economic reforms. Firstly, a massive land reform campaign was initiated to transfer agricultural land out of the hands of large-scale farmers and landlords and into the hands of poorer peasants. While this reduced economic inequality, it was not without violence, and there were many instances of the former landlords being attacked or even murdered across China in the early 1950s. In tandem, a huge drive was initiated to crack down on opium production and consumption across the country, a habit which was partly a legacy of British meddling into the Chinese economy in the 19th century. In the 1950s, millions of opium addicts and habitual users were press-ganged into labor reform camps. They were joined in these by the hundreds of thousands of individuals who Mao's regime branded as counter-revolutionaries, many of them being former members of the Kuomintang. And Mao also launched the new People's Republic onto the world stage by entering into the Korean War, which broke out in the summer of 1950 between a communist North and an American-backed South. Massive Chinese aid ensured that the conflict ended in a stalemate 3 years later. It also led to a split of relations between Mao's new regime and the United States, one which involved a trade embargo which lasted for over 20 years. In the 1950s, Mao had formed a clear idea of how he believed communism should develop in China. It would be incorrect to assume that Mao Zedong was simply a powermonger who used communist ideology to secure authority in China. Certainly, he was a brutal autocrat, a fact which would become strikingly clear as his long chairmanship continued on into the 1960s and 1970s. But he had also read widely on Marxist-Leninist thought and had a vision for how communism would develop in China. In the early 1950s, that vision involved the industrial capacity of China's burgeoning cities of the East Coast and its great rivers, leading the country away from its reliance on agriculture. As Mao described it, the communists had come to power by the Red Army encircling the cities occupied by the nationalists and the Japanese, and then absorbing the cities when they were strong enough. Now, the direct opposite was needed. China's cities would need to expand outward and bring the country closer to achieving communism as Marx had intended it. To that end, in 1953, the first 5-year plan was initiated in China in imitation of the 5-year plans which the Soviet Union had begun employing in Russia in the 1920s. The first 5-year plan of 1953 to 1957 was geared primarily towards reducing the reliance of the Chinese economy on agricultural output and moving towards becoming a global power through the creation of an industrial economy. With Soviet financial support and expertise provided through Russian advisors, new factories were built across the country during the plan. Farms were collectivized across China and placed under state management, and billions of yuan were spent in total on completing 595 large and medium-sized infrastructural and economic projects, including railways, major roads, and new dams, often linking parts of China with each other in ways which had never been possible before. As a result, Chinese industrial productivity increased by 128%, and steel production alone jumped from 1.35 million tons in 1953 to over 5 million in 1957. Coal extraction doubled during the 5 years, while in agriculture, yields of grain and cotton rose by over 30% during the same time period. Overall, the first 5-year plan under Mao was a tremendous success in pure economic terms, but in its success were sown the seeds of destruction, for a hubris now entered into Mao and his colleagues' thinking, a hubris which would be injected with catastrophic consequences into the second 5-year plan, or as it is more commonly known, the Great Leap Forward. On the 22nd of May 1957, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had succeeded Stalin on his death in 1953, delivered a speech at a regional meeting of Soviet representatives, in the course of which he proclaimed that it was his goal that the Soviet Union should catch up and overtake America in economic output by 1980. A few months later, in November 1957, at a gathering in Moscow of international communist leaders to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, which had brought the Soviets to power in 1917, he repeated his claim. Only now he was even more ambitious. The Soviets would now eclipse the Americans within 15 years. Mao, who wished for China to rival the Soviet Union, and whose relationship with Khrushchev was more antagonistic than it had been with Stalin, began pondering this goal in the aftermath of the Soviet leader's speech. Not to be outdone, he quickly determined to make similar claims, and made it known that it was China's goal to catch up with Britain's economy within 15 years and exceed their production of steel and other core industrial outputs. With this goal in mind, in 1958, the Chinese Communist Party initiated the second 5-year plan, or what was soon referred to as the Great Leap Forward, for the country's economy. It would result in the most catastrophic famine the world has ever seen. Mao believed that the key indicators of how China's economy was progressing would be seen in grain and steel production. If these could be increased rapidly, it would show the Soviets in Moscow and the world in general that China was asserting itself on the world stage. Accordingly, all of the instruments of the state were deployed in 1958 to begin increasing the rate of grain and steel production by establishing new smelting factories and turning ever greater amounts of agricultural land over to grain production. Massive amounts of farmland were collectivized into giant state farms towards this end, and millions of workers were redeployed to different parts of the economy than they were trained for. Huge amounts of state funding were also given out to aid in the effort, and party officials were sent out into the countryside and the towns, charged with maximizing production. However, many of these initiatives were potentially hazardous to begin with, as the state was employing experimental farming methods in some instances, and in others was turning over land to grain production which was more suited to other crops. In other instances, workers were being sent into steel factories with little or no training in what they were doing. It was an inauspicious beginning in 1958, but one which would get much worse over time. Despite these structural issues, there were some initial signs of progress. Steel and iron production did increase in the initial stages of the Great Leap Forward, perhaps by as much as 30 to 40% in 1958, but the mechanism whereby it was being increased would prove catastrophic in some instances. In their eagerness to show good results, local party cadres throughout the country were often resorting to unimaginably short-sighted and brutal tactics. The more cruel methods involved overworking their laborers in the factories to try to have larger amounts of steel produced. But within a few months, party officials throughout the country were also setting up what became known as backyard furnaces, the use of which Mao had actually encouraged. These were essentially makeshift steel furnaces, which were often set up in the yards of people's homes. Scrap metal was used to produce pig iron, which was almost totally useless. But the worst thing was that farming tools and other instruments which were needed for producing food throughout the country were often being thrown into these backyard furnaces and melted down so that local party officials could record higher outputs of alleged steel production in their areas. The result was a lack of basic tools for farming as the months went by. The effect of all this between 1958 and 1961 was catastrophic, with millions of farmers being press-ganged into working in factories in the cities and towns. There was not enough people available to produce food throughout China in a country which was often on a subsistence food level anyway. Added to this was the practice of party officials destroying basic farming equipment to inflate the amount of steel they were producing in their areas. Furthermore, the party had begun trying to use experimental irrigation methods, which had rendered large amounts of farmland temporarily unusable in some areas. Given all this, it is unsurprising that even by the autumn of 1958, just months after the Great Leap Forward had started, there were major food shortages in some parts of the country, and this was further compounded by the fact that the government continued to export grain and other agricultural products in order to increase its revenue and also keep up the appearance that productivity was increasing. By late 1958, people in certain parts of the country were beginning to start foraging for wild foods in the countryside, and others were starving to death. This was just the beginning though, and by 1959, grain production had fallen by roughly 15 to 20% in total across the country. There is considerable debate as to how much Mao knew about what was unfolding across China as a result of the Great Leap Forward. It is quite possible that in late 1958 and early 1959, he was unaware of the famine conditions, but evidence has been uncovered which suggests he knew by at least the late spring of 1959, and yet did not do enough to change course. By 1960, when he delegated control of certain parts of the Great Leap Forward program to others, the Central Party members were actively trying to prevent the worst, but by then it was too late. The forces which were unleashed in 1958 and 1959 reverberated into 1960 and 1961, and famine struck China over each of these years with varying degrees of severity. There have been many different estimates of the number of people who died in recent years, as the opening of certain archives in China has allowed for more accurate assessments, but scholars are generally agreed that at least 25 million people died in a country, the population of which was approximately 660 million in 1958. Frank Dicotta, who studied the period in detail and who saw the Great Leap Forward as Mao's Great Famine, in the title of his study of these events, suggested the death toll was as many as 55 million people. Others would suggest somewhere between 30 and 45 million, making this the most catastrophic famine in human history in terms of sheer numbers of deaths. The second five-year plan, advertised as the Great Leap Forward, came to an end in 1962. Curiously, it was relatively underreported internationally, as much of the information concerning it was transmitted through the Republic of China's government in Taiwan or the British enclave of Hong Kong, and many foreign services believed they were exaggerating the extent of the suffering caused for political purposes. Internally, however, it had badly compromised Mao's leadership. On the 27th of April 1959, Mao's term as chairman of the People's Republic of China came to an end, although he retained his position as chairman of the Communist Party and of military affairs. He was succeeded by Liu Shaoqi, and by January 1962, the Great Leap Forward was being wound down. At this time, Liu made a speech at what was to become known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference, in which he denounced the Great Leap Forward. It was a very thinly veiled public rebuke of Mao, the likes of which would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Nevertheless, while Mao had lost some of his authority for now, he was still very much in charge. He would, however, have to govern in a more collective fashion, with figures such as Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who had done much to recover the economic situation in the wake of the disastrous policies of the late 1950s. The 1960s also saw China increasingly isolated on the world stage. Tensions had been brewing between Mao and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ever since the latter succeeded Stalin in the mid-1950s. Mao was particularly perturbed by Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin's brutal authoritarianism and more moderate stance towards the Western powers. He also found himself increasingly at loggerheads with Moscow about the two regimes' interpretation of orthodox Marxism. Relations were bad by the late 1950s, but they became particularly acute in the early 1960s, especially once the Cuban Missile Crisis inspired Khrushchev to begin working more closely with the US government of John F. Kennedy to defuse the Cold War in ways which Mao opposed. A sign of the split was seen in 1961, when Mao denounced the Soviet regime as revisionist traitors. For his part, Khrushchev was increasingly wary of Mao's attitude towards the possibility of a nuclear war with the West. Mao once worryingly suggested that if 300 million Chinese people died in a nuclear war, the other half would still be alive to secure victory. And so, the Russian leader must have been concerned in 1964 when the Chinese successfully tested their first nuclear bomb. But by then, the Sino-Soviet split was complete. While much is known about the political life of the man who oversaw this split with Russia and the catastrophes of the Great Leap Forward, the more private Mao remains something of an enigma. His fourth marriage, that to Chiang in 1938, lasted for the remainder of his life, though Mao engaged in a string of extramarital affairs, including, most controversially, in his later life, with a private secretary, Zhang Yufeng, who was in her early 20s when she first entered Mao's employ. He had at least 10 children, several of whom had been born in the 1920s and with whom he had very little relationship, as he had had to leave them with others during the long Civil War years. He spent much of his private time writing and was a prolific composer of political writings and poems, while his reading habits tended to favor traditional Chinese literature. By temperament, he would become aggressive when challenged, but his demeanor was certainly not genuinely unhinged like Stalin had been in Russia during the 1930s and 1940s. For Mao, state violence was engaged in for political rather than personal purposes, but a great deal about his other personal motivations and inclinations are shrouded behind a public image which was closely managed during his lifetime. The Sino-Soviet split and the catastrophic consequences of the Great Leap Forward were the background against which Mao initiated what has today become known as simply the Cultural Revolution, but the full name of which was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Launched in 1966, the Cultural Revolution was designed to be a political and social movement which aimed to purify Chinese society and Chinese communism by removing any of the vestiges of Chinese traditionalism which remained and the capitalist and bourgeois elements within it. Mao claimed that a bourgeois bureaucracy had developed within the Chinese Communist Party that was leading China in the wrong direction, and this, along with communist revisionists such as those who were now in power in Russia, needed to be stopped, and a renewed dedication to the communist cause developed. In particular, Mao called on the younger generations of China, those which had been born after the Second World War and who had never known life in China before communist rule, to bombard the headquarters to purify Chinese society of these bourgeois capitalist elements and to reinvigorate the communist movement. There has been a widespread debate as to what Mao's motivations for launching the Cultural Revolution were. Some historians have argued that he genuinely believed that the Chinese Communist Party and the huge administration which operated under it throughout China had been compromised by nearly 20 years in power, and that a cultural reawakening was necessary to stop the bureaucratic degeneration of the country. However, while this might have been a motivating factor for Mao, there is no doubt that the Cultural Revolution was primarily conceived as a way for the chairman to resuscitate his control over the Communist Party and the country as a whole. By its very nature, the movement allowed Mao to use the party's apparatus and wider organs of the state to purge the government of his opponents and competing factions. These had multiplied in number in the early 1960s as the catastrophic impact of the Great Leap Forward was felt across the country. Now, Mao would eliminate those who had dared to cross him in the most brutal purges seen within the Chinese Communist Party. The result would be years of unrest, which turned ordinary Chinese people against each other and created an environment of fear and suspicion. The Cultural Revolution was initiated in May 1966, with Mao urging the people and students in particular to act to purify the party ranks. Within weeks, gangs of students were attacking their teachers, intellectuals, government officials, and even people who were deemed to be wearing bourgeois clothing. These attacks could range from being mild to moderately violent, such as when teachers were attacked by gangs of students and had their heads shaved, to truly bloody acts, such as when government officials were actually murdered or driven to commit suicide. As the frenzy built up in the summer of 1966, official party newspapers stoked the flames by calling on the masses to clear away the evil habits of the old society and attack the monsters and demons. By now, students in classrooms and on college campuses across China were organizing themselves into bands of so-called Red Guards, committed to preserving the Communist Revolution and rooting out what were termed the Four Olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits, and old culture. By the early autumn, gangs of teenagers wearing red armbands roamed the streets of cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, and the unrest was so visceral that August became known as Red August. Soon, the initial student-led violence spread to other groups, and factory workers and laborers on collectivized farms began joining what was termed the Red Terror. Meanwhile, Mao was directing these groups, as best they could be directed, against his enemies within the government and the wider party apparatus. But as a means of purging the party of his opponents, this was a very unstable method. By 1967, radical elements were threatening to move beyond Mao's ability to control them. But the Cultural Revolution nevertheless continued. In 1968, Mao initiated the Down to the Countryside, whereby the children of supposed middle-class bourgeois urban families were forced into what were effectively re-education camps in the countryside. Meanwhile, the chairman was building up an ever greater cult of personality around himself, in part led by the publication of his Little Red Book, a collection of his sayings and writings which became central to the concept of Maoism in China around this time. The violence continued unabated through the late 1960s, but by 1971, even Mao was aware of the need to scale things back, and though the Cultural Revolution is deemed by some to have only ended with Mao's death in 1976, the worst of the unrest subsided in the early 1970s. As with the enormous famine created by the Great Leap Forward 10 years earlier, historians have found it difficult to precisely identify how many people died as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Estimates tend to vary between 500,000 and 2 million people, having lost their lives as a result of the violence which swept through China between 1966 and 1971. Many of these were killed by the Red Guards and other groups, triggered into fanaticism by Mao's injunctions. However, probably the greater proportion of these lost their lives in instances where the army was called in to quell the unrest, or by the army and the Communist Party being directed to purge certain groups by Mao himself. Just as damaging was the psychological pain inflicted on a society where people were effectively turned against each other by the state. Perhaps the most glaring example of this occurred in Guangxi province in the south of the country, where between 100,000 and 150,000 lives were lost during the Cultural Revolution. People here even resorted to burying the persecuted alive, or boiling or disemboweling them, and there was systematic cannibalism engaged in Guangxi, as the frenzied masses sought to literally devour their enemies in their fervor. Ultimately, the Cultural Revolution scarred Chinese society in ways which are hard to quantify. The early 1970s witnessed a major event in China's relations on the international stage, which has had important implications down to the present day. Chinese involvement in the Korean War had seen diplomatic ties between the People's Republic and the United States government effectively shut down, with trade sanctions imposed on China by Washington. However, with the passage of 20 years, both sides were cautiously investigating the possibility of re-establishing diplomatic ties. During the course of the 1968 US presidential election, the Republican candidate Richard Nixon had proposed making overtures to China to that effect, and after he entered office, negotiations commenced. In 1971, Nixon's national security advisor Henry Kissinger went on a secret diplomatic mission to Beijing, and this was followed in February 1972 by an official state visit in China by Nixon, during the course of which he met Mao, the first meeting between a Chinese and American head of state since the Second World War, which has grown ever greater in importance since, and which is now regarded by many as the most significant international relationship between two states in the world. Despite the veneer of normality which was lent to US-Chinese relations by the official state visit of Nixon in 1972, at home, the Chinese government continued to operate in an extreme fashion. By the time Nixon visited, Mao was nearly 80 years of age, and owing to years of chain smoking, he was suffering from numerous physical ailments. It was due to this and the cult of personality which he had built up around himself that he allowed a number of senior Communist Party members to become immensely influential in China in his final years. These were known as the Gang of Four, which consisted of Mao's wife Jiang Qing, Jiang Zhongqiao, an ultra-Maoist writer who had come to prominence during the 1960s for his denunciation of bourgeois elements within Chinese society, a close ally of Chun Qiao's, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, a younger political figure who had risen from within the Shanghai branch of the Chinese Communist Party to become one of its highest-ranking figures during the Cultural Revolution. The Gang of Four had done much to promote the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1971. But even after the most extreme period of the purges ended in the late 1960s, their influence over Mao's government continued. The last years of Mao's life and his primacy in the politics of China are hard to characterize, as competing forces were at work in the halls of power in Beijing. Certainly, Mao remained wedded to the idea of clinging to power until the very end. As a result, he continued to allow the Gang of Four and their supporters to hold considerable influence in the country. However, separately, there was a growing clique of individuals who coalesced around other older stalwarts of the party, such as the former head of the Red Army and Premier Zhou Enlai, and the former General Secretary of the party Deng Xiaoping, who wished to break from some of the more traditional ideological values of the party espoused by Mao and introduce a greater degree of professionalism into the running of the government and the economy. There was also much bitterness within the party establishment at the damage wrought by the Cultural Revolution, as individuals who had fought the Japanese and the nationalists in the 1930s and 1940s had often been purged from the party in the late 1960s, only to be gradually rehabilitated in the 1970s. Acrimony between all these groups characterized the politics of China in the final years of Mao's life, and it was he himself who was largely responsible for creating this situation. The political uncertainty of the post-Cultural Revolution period was still unresolved as Mao entered the final stages of his life. His health had further deteriorated in the mid-1970s, and he was suffering from several heart and lung ailments, the latter aggravated considerably by his chain smoking, while there were unconfirmed rumors of a considerable reliance on sleeping pills which had developed over the years. On the 27th of May 1976, he met the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, on a state visit at which the last known photo of Mao was taken. But by then, he had already suffered the first of several heart attacks that occurred between the spring and autumn of 1976, and which left him increasingly incapacitated. The final one on the 5th of September left him largely unable to move, and he died 4 days later. A state funeral lasting a week followed between the 11th and the 18th of September 1976, during which 1 million Chinese people filed past his body. Today, the enormous mausoleum of Mao Zedong housing his embalmed body stands in the middle of Tiananmen Square in central Beijing, on the site where the Gate of China, the southern gate of the old imperial city between the 14th and the 20th centuries, used to stand before its destruction in 1954. It is perhaps fitting as a statement of where ancient China ended and modern China began. Mao's death occurred at a time when the older leadership of the entire Chinese Communist Party, the generation who had come to political consciousness during the May 4th movement all the way back in 1919, was fading from Chinese life. The old leader of the Red Army, and a possible successor to Mao, Zhou Enlai, had predeceased Mao by just a few months. Consequently, Mao had appointed the Minister for Public Security, Hua Guofeng, as his successor shortly before his death. He succeeded as chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in 1976, but he would not last long. Guofeng was outmaneuvered in the years that followed by Deng Xiaoping, who became the de facto leader of China in 1978, though Guofeng's brief period as leader was significant in arresting and charging the Gang of Four as being responsible for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. In all but one instance, they subsequently were sentenced to life in prison under Deng Xiaoping's leadership. Elsewhere, despite his impeccable communist credentials, Deng Xiaoping quickly moved China away from its planned economy and the more authoritarian aspects of Mao's reign, setting term limits on the holding of office. It was during Deng's tenure as Mao's successor that the roots of China's economic miracle can really be found, as he opened the country up to foreign investment and expertise. Thus, in the end, Mao proved to be the impediment to China's growth, rather than the deliverer of it. Mao Zedong is one of the most contentious individuals in Chinese history, and indeed the history of the modern world. To some, he was a brutal tyrant and a mass murderer, under whose rule between 1949 and 1946, over 50 million people and perhaps as many as 80 million died prematurely, whether as a result of the catastrophic failures of the Great Leap Forward, the waves of violence unleashed during the Cultural Revolution, or government-orchestrated disasters such as the Banqiao Dam failure of 1975, which by some estimates resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people. However, to many others, he is one of the great heroes of modern-day China, the man who ensured that the cause of Chinese communism survived during the Long March of the 1930s, the commander who led Chinese resistance to the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, and the individual who thereafter led the Red Army to victory over the nationalists. Many who focus on his achievements will also point towards the fact that life expectancy rates and living standards in China increased dramatically between the 1940s and the 1970s, and argue that Mao laid the basis for China's economic miracle, which began in the late 20th century. It is indeed striking that one individual can provoke such widely diverging opinions. There is no doubting Mao's critical role in ensuring the ascent to power of the Communist Party in China. Without Mao, the movement might not have survived the 1930s, and his leadership was also critical in the post-war period. But once he secured power, this individual, who was clearly possessed of a considerable intellect and ability, became obsessed.
The man known to history as Chiang Kai-shek was born on the 31st of October 1887 in the town of Shiko in Zhejiang province in the eastern region of China, on the other side of Hangzhou Bay from the city of Shanghai. His father was Chiang Jiao-tsung, a moderately prosperous merchant. His father before him had found success as a salt merchant, but Jiao-tsung expanded his business interests into selling rice wine, rice, vegetables and other commodities. Chiang's mother was Wang Cai-yu. She and Jiao-tsung had 4 children together, of whom Chiang was the third. Chiang's life was shaped by political and social processes, which were already underway when he was born in 1887. A half a century earlier, China's long-held policy of cutting itself off from Western influences had come to a crushing end when Britain went to war with the Chinese in an effort to, amongst other things, force it to open its ports to the sale of opium from British India. In the decades that followed, China had gone through political and social revolutions as its culture was bombarded with Western ideas. Similar processes were underway in neighboring Korea and Japan, though Japan adapted more quickly and by the 1880s was emerging as a regional power with a Western-style government and military. In contrast, China was being pulled between two opposing factions. One consisted of traditionalists who wanted to maintain the style of imperial government that had prevailed for millennia, and which had been represented by the Qing dynasty of emperors who had ruled since 1644. The others wanted to create a republic, although even amongst these there were competing factions who wanted a conservative republic based on traditional values such as Confucianism, and those who were inspired by radical socialist thinkers from industrial Europe, whose writings were being read in intellectual circles in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. The battle to reconcile these competing outlooks was the backdrop against which Chiang grew up and lived. When he was 8 years old, Chiang's father died. His mother was left largely destitute, and in later years, Chiang would speak of being left virtually orphaned at this time. Although she lived until the early 1920s, it was a difficult childhood thereafter. In 1906, he determined to take charge of his life by heading to Japan, the most modernized nation in the Far East, one which had recently managed to defeat Russia in a brief war, to acquire military training within the Japanese army. There he spent time at Shinbu Gakko Military Academy in Tokyo. The academy was a place of learning for many Chinese students at the time, and was a hotbed of political radicalism, with many of the students looking towards the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in Beijing and the modernization of China so that it might emerge as a revitalized power similar to Japan. One of the radical groups here during Chiang's time was a branch of the Tungmenghui, or United League, a secret society that had been founded back in 1905 by one Sun Yat-sen, a Chinese philosopher and revolutionary who had spent time in the United States and had returned to Asia determined to achieve what he called the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and welfare. Inherent in his political philosophy was a determination to overthrow the Qing dynasty, which he not only perceived as being archaic, but also critiqued as a dynasty of the Northern or Manchu Chinese. Chiang would become intrinsically connected with Sun Yat-sen and the political movements he led for the next 20 years. Between 1909 and 1911, Chiang continued to serve in the Japanese Imperial Army, while also fostering his associations with Chinese revolutionary movements. He only returned to China in the late autumn of 1911 when the outbreak of a revolution, known to posterity as the Xinhai Revolution, led to a major political crisis for the Qing dynasty government. The imperial government had been weakened already through the succession of a 2-year-old emperor, Puyi, in 1908, and without strong leadership and little desire to maintain the imperial regime throughout China at large, the imperial system collapsed in a matter of weeks. On the 1st of January 1912, a new Republic of China was brought into being, bringing the imperial system which had dominated the country for over 2 millennia to an end. Sun Yat-sen was appointed as the provisional president of the republic. By then, Chiang was active in the politics of the city of Shanghai and moved between there and the capital of the new republic, Beijing. In the autumn of 1912, he was involved with Sun Yat-sen in the creation of the Nationalist Party, a political successor to the Tungmenghui. While the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 and the creation of the Republic of China were momentous events in China's history and its modernization, they did not bring a stable democracy into being. In the 1910s and into the 1920s, the political landscape was a chaotic one, in which warlords who had formed part of the old imperial system carved out their own principalities in the provinces. Additionally, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang, and the nationalists were soon outflanked in the country's constitutional politics by the Progressive Party that was formed in 1913. This led to what is known as the Second Revolution. a period in which Sun Yat-sen and his followers refused to acknowledge the authority of the Beiyang government in Beijing, led by Yuan Shikai, an old Chinese general who was seen as being tainted by his associations with the Qing dynasty, and who briefly tried to restore the monarchy in 1915. There was, in effect, a form of civil war throughout China during these years, although it was a very chaotic state of affairs rather than an organized conflict between competing entities. Chiang was a bit player in all of this, a mid-ranking figure within the Nationalist Party, one who acted as a liaison for Sun Yat-sen between Japan and Shanghai, traveling over and back between the two. But few people who knew him during these years would have predicted his rise to national prominence in years to come. As these momentous events were playing out in China's politics, Chiang's personal life was taking on a complex shape as well. Back in 1901, Chiang had been married when he was just 14 years old, to a woman named Mao Fumei, a 19-year-old acquaintance of the family. This was an arranged marriage which was entered into for financial reasons to aid the family following Chiang's father's death several years earlier. Their tumultuous relationship reflected this unorthodox start. Chiang followed the practice of concubinage, a Chinese tradition whereby he took mistresses that were almost like second or third wives. One of these was Yao Ye-chung, a woman he began a relationship with in 1912. While later in 1921, he started a separate relationship again with Chun Jie-ru, a 15-year-old girl that he had first met a few years earlier when she was either 12 or 13. These overlapping relationships have led some accounts of his life to state that Chiang technically had multiple wives, though he divorced Mao Fumei in 1921 when his relationship with Chun Jie-ru became more formalized. Only one biological child, a son named Chiang Ching-kuo, born to Mao Fumei and he in 1910, was born of these relationships, although Chiang also adopted a second son, Chiang Wei-kuo, the illegitimate son of an associate of Chiang's in Japan in the mid-1910s, who gave up the child for fear of disgrace. Chiang's political career shifted considerably in the late 1910s and into the 1920s. In 1919, Sun Yat-sen, along with other Chinese revolutionaries such as Chiang, formed the Kuomintang, a new political party as a successor to the Nationalist Party, a name which translates as China's National People's Party. This new iteration of the party was based out of Guangdong, in the south of the country, and was committed to armed struggle to overthrow the government in Beijing and unify the country under a strong centralized leadership. It was willing to accept the help of any group which would further that goal, including the new communist regime which had seized power in Russia late in 1917, and which was gradually winning a civil war there to establish the Soviet Union. In the autumn of 1923, Chiang was sent by Sun Yat-sen on a mission to Moscow to organize additional aid to the Kuomintang and to review the Soviet military system. Chiang was not entirely convinced that the Soviet system was suitable for China, though Sun Yat-sen is claimed today as one of the forefathers of the Chinese Communist movement. As a result of Sun Yat-sen's death in the spring of 1925, the Kuomintang would come to be identified as the power opposed to communism in China. With this, Chiang began to exercise increasing control of the Kuomintang and move the nationalists in a different ideological direction to what Sun Yat-sen had planned. The event which really catapulted Chiang to the forefront of Chinese politics and made him a pivotal figure in the history of modern China was the Northern Expedition. This was a military expedition which the Kuomintang commenced in the summer of 1926, under his military leadership. Its name is derived from the fact that the nationalists headed north from their base in the southeast of the country to campaign against the warlords that controlled the provinces in the north and against the government that operated from Beijing. When it commenced in July 1926, Chiang had less than 100,000 men under his command, a moderate force given the sheer size and population of China. A series of swift victories in the months that followed saw Chiang wrest control of the provinces of Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian by the end of 1926. His forces swelled as he did so, and by the time he began his attacks on Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, He and the rest of the Kuomintang commanders had 500,000 followers. With such an immense force, they managed to secure control of central China and established a provisional government at their new capital of Nanjing in the late spring. From here, the northern expedition would continue through 1927 and into 1928, eventually unifying most of the country under nationalist rule after a decade and a half of division and anarchy since the promulgation of the Republic back in 1912. But it would be an all-too-fleeting victory. Chiang was the central character in creating the split in the nationalist movement, which led to the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War even as the northern expedition was still underway. The tendency today is to view the Kuomintang as a right-wing organization, and there is little doubt that it became so over time under Chiang's leadership, albeit with socialist elements to it even during the Civil War. However, in the first half of the 1920s, it was a much more complex and fluid political movement, one with a left wing and a right wing, as exemplified in Chiang's own mission to the Soviet Union late in 1923. These divisions became more stark in the first months of the Northern Expedition, as the left wing, led by Wang Jingwei at this time, formed a solid block of opposition to the right wing, which was emerging under Chiang in the closing months of 1926. This left wing was increasingly dominated by communists who were close to Russian military advisors and politicians who were active in China. When Chiang led the campaign to Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, the left wing formed a splinter faction that tried to retain control of the city of Wuhan, which had briefly served as the Kuomintang's headquarters in the final months of 1926. Thus, even before Chiang secured Shanghai and Nanjing in the spring of 1927, the left wing under Jingwei had already begun to splinter at Wuhan. While divisions were rife already by 1927, Chiang and his conservative allies within the nationalist movement spurred on the drift towards civil war in the weeks after capturing Shanghai and Nanjing by violently suppressing communist movements and groups within the captured cities, a campaign of repression termed the White Terror. The worst of this came in Shanghai on the 12th of April 1927, when Kuomintang military units acting on Chiang's orders began purging the city's communist groups. Similar incidents were replicated across the cities under nationalist control in the weeks that followed, and by the late summer it was clear that the communists would have to oppose the Kuomintang leadership if their ideological goals were to survive. Hence, the Chinese Civil War began on the 1st of August 1927, when left-wing nationalists began an uprising in Nanchang, a date which is typically identified in Chinese communist history as marking the formation of the People's Liberation Army. The movement was led by figures like Wang Jingwei, Zhu De, and Zhou Enlai at this juncture. Mao Zedong was a minor leader within the initial uprisings who would only rise to the fore of the Chinese communist movement in the 1930s. The period around the commencement of the Chinese Civil War was one of further unrest in Chiang's personal life, though it also led to lasting stability in his romantic life. Many years earlier, back when the Kuomintang was being formed in the late 1910s, he had met and begun a quasi-relationship with Sung Mei-ling, the daughter of Charlie Sung, a prominent Chinese businessman who had spent time in America in his youth, hence his anglicized name. The Sung family became prominent in Chinese business and political circles thereafter, and Mei-ling's sister, Qingling, had been the wife of Sun Yat-sen for the last decade of his life. Mei-ling's family had warned her off a relationship with Chiang back in the late 1910s, owing to his wife and concubines and the fact that he was over a decade older than her. But in the mid-1920s, they began spending time together. In 1927, Chiang divorced Chung Jieru and ended his concubine relationship with Yao Ye-chung in order to marry Mei-ling. Thereafter, he remained a broadly monogamous husband. This final marriage of his would last for the remainder of his life, and Mei-ling became a prominent figure within the Kuomintang in her own right. They would not have children, though Mei-ling may have suffered a miscarriage in 1928. From 1927 onwards, even as the civil war between the nationalists and the communists was raging, Chiang and the other Kuomintang leaders were overseeing a period of Chinese governmental reform and expansion, known as the Nanjing Decade, so termed because the capital remained at Nanjing even after Beijing was seized. While many criticisms could be leveled at the nationalists, there was no denying that this was a period of progress in a number of important respects. The economy expanded, principally through a cooperative movement which revolutionized the cotton industry. The number of factories increased massively, while there was nearly 4 times as much length of modern highways in China by 1936 as there had been in 1927, as a nationalist road-building program was initiated. Access to education expanded greatly and literacy levels increased. Things as simple as an effective postal system and an operational banking system emerged after decades of sluggishness in introducing such modern concepts into China. Yet there were issues. Regional famines and food shortages persisted. At the same time, while Chiang was the most powerful figure within the Kuomintang, he was far from all-powerful, and numerous factions had power ebb and flow between them in the decade following the Northern Expedition. It was clear by the time the Northern Expedition was achieving its goal of unifying much of China in 1928 that the nationalist movement was not exactly a homogeneous ideology, and various factions within it were now descending into a civil war. So what did Chiang actually stand for as a leader of the right wing of the Kuomintang? Where the communist left-wing branch was modern and socialist in its outlook, Chiang looked backwards to a more traditional view of Chinese society, one rooted in Confucianism, the philosophical religion that had shaped so much of Chinese society for millennia. He also incorporated elements of conservative imperialist traditions into his political philosophy. In this sense, he was profoundly different to Sun Yat-sen as well, a figure he claimed to be the political successor to, but who had been a modern liberal who admired figures like the British liberal philosophers John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, and John Stuart Mill Sr. and Jr., as well as Theodore Roosevelt in the United States. These views of Chiang were most clearly expressed in the 1930s in the New Life movement, a civic campaign led by the nationalists which sought to promote Neo-Confucian values and a form of Chinese corporatism, exemplified in the Blue Shirt Society, a Chinese version of the fascism sweeping Europe in the 1930s. This raises questions as to who Chiang himself was. Much like the political movement he led, he was a bundle of contradictions. On the one hand, he presented himself as a stalwart conservative and upholder of Chinese traditions, set within a more modern China. But on a personal level, he could be erratic, violent, and oppressive towards those around him. On occasion, this resulted in him physically attacking members of his staff. Despite his support for upright behavior in public life, he was incredibly corrupt and fostered such corruption in the Kuomintang generally. These contrasting approaches were perhaps most clearly seen through his sons. His adoptive son, Chiang Wei-kuo, was sent to Germany and ended up a junior officer in the German Wehrmacht, taking part in the Nazi annexation of Austria, while his biological son, Chiang Ching-kuo, spent many years in Soviet Russia. The one thing that can be said without equivocation is that Chiang was an ultra-nationalist. One American military commentator referred to Chiang's one major publication, a book called China's Destiny, as a Chinese Mein Kampf. Such was its xenophobic portrayal of people beyond China's borders. Another thing that is undoubted is that Chiang was a reasonably effective military commander. In the course of the late 1920s and the early 1930s, he very nearly won the Chinese Civil War. By the end of the 1920s, he and the nationalists had successfully managed to wrest control of virtually all of eastern China, where the great cities of the nation lay along the coastline, from the communists, isolating the communists in regions like Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, and Shanxi provinces towards central China. By then, Mao Zedong was emerging as a new leader of the Chinese Communist movement, though it would be the 1940s before he became preeminent. The communist movement very nearly didn't survive that long. In the autumn of 1933, Chiang's armies began an encirclement of the communist position in Jiangxi, and over the space of a year-long campaign very nearly wiped out the communist movement in China. It only remained alive as units of the Chinese Red Army broke through the nationalist cordon late in 1934 and began what has been immortalized in Chinese communist propaganda as the Long March to Freedom. The movement remained alive into the second half of the 1930s, but there is no doubt that prior to Japanese intervention in China from 1937 onwards, Chiang and the Kuomintang were on the cusp of complete victory. Late in 1936, Chiang faced the greatest threat to his own life in many years. On the 12th of December that year, he was in the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province in central China to review a military detachment when he was taken prisoner. Chiang had traveled to Xi'an in the first place to review the troops and raise their morale here, as there had been issues with divisions in the region being unwilling to fight the communists. The issue ran much deeper, and in reality the communists had infiltrated the army here. As a result, on the 12th, soldiers stormed the complex where he was staying and took him captive. In Nanjing, the government was in disarray when news arrived. Meanwhile, the communists sent Zhou Enlai, a figure who would rise to become the second most powerful politician in communist China in the 1950s, to negotiate with Chiang. Over a course of a week or so, Zhou and he came to an arrangement whereby Chiang would be released on condition that he would commence peace negotiations once back in Nanjing, and that they would then combine to resist Japan's expansion in the Far East. With this, Chiang was released on the 26th of December, after 2 weeks in captivity. He returned to Nanjing and did order a ceasefire, but the nationalists were deeply divided into 1937 about how to proceed regarding the communists in the aftermath of the Xi'an incident. The Xi'an incident pointed towards the spectre that was now haunting China from without. Japan had modernized so effectively by the 20th century that it was determined to become the preeminent power in the Far East and the Western Pacific. Having conquered Korea decades earlier, in 1931 the imperial government invaded the Manchuria region of northeastern China and formed it into the puppet state of Manchukuo. A wider war was avoided through Chinese reticence to engage with Japan at that time, while the nationalists and the communists were mired in civil war. But in the summer of 1937, the Japanese invaded China again, this time occupying the major cities of the east. Beijing and Shanghai both fell quickly, and Nanjing was captured in December 1937, leading to mass atrocities in the nationalist capital by the Japanese in the weeks that followed. During the Rape of Nanjing, as it is termed, upwards of 200,000 people were murdered and tens of thousands of women were raped. Chiang had eloped with his government and divisions of the Kuomintang to the city of Chongqing, further inland in central China, which the Chinese resistance to Japanese occupation would establish as their capital for years to come. The outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War presented a problem for both Chiang and the leaders of the communist movement, like Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. They would not continue to fight with one another while also trying to resist the Japanese in eastern China. An uneasy peace was accordingly patched together for the duration of the conflict, however long it might last, against the occupying power. An additional benefit of this was that while the communists could acquire aid from the Soviets in Russia, Chiang and the nationalists had favorable ties with the British in India and Burma, as well as the United States, which was already anxious by 1938 and 1939 about Japanese expansion in the Pacific, a sphere which America considered absolutely vital to its economic and national interests. Both Chiang and his allies and the communist leaders were in no doubt, however, that as soon as Japan was defeated, the civil war would resume. It would be many years before that occurred. From 1938, a bitter struggle commenced, with the nationalists and the communists controlling much of the west and central regions of China, while Japan was largely content to occupy the economically more important west and south of China, where the great cities of the country lay along the course of the Yellow, Yangtze, and Pearl rivers. That the Japanese did not press westwards and attempt to conclusively defeat the nationalists and the communists was in large part because their interest was drawn elsewhere. Japan desperately needed oil if it was to have any chance of besting the United States in a war. The nearest large supply of this was in Southeast Asia, around the Dutch East Indies, and also British wells in Burma and around Borneo and Brunei in the East Indies. Supplies of oil, steel, and other resources needed for warfare were also prerequisites for Japan to be able to defeat Chiang and his armies in central China. So when the US cut off supplies of oil and steel to Japan in the course of 1940 and 1941, it left the Japanese with no option but to either risk a war with the US or else abandon its expansionist policy. The regime in Tokyo chose war and attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941. It was the salvation of the Chinese cause. Within a year, the Second World War had turned decisively against Japan and its main ally, Nazi Germany, and with America's economy transformed to focus exclusively on the conflict, war material began arriving to the Chinese in ever greater amounts in 1942, 1943, and 1944. Chiang held the office of Premier of the Republic of China in the Chongqing government for most of the war period. He had held this office periodically during the 1930s, though not without interruption, while from April 1938 he would serve as the Director General of the Kuomintang until his death nearly 4 decades later. Therefore, while there were other rivals for power within the nationalist government during the Nanjing Decade, the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 allowed Chiang to consolidate his control over the government. Given this, he should be viewed unequivocally as the individual who was responsible for the prolific corruption of the nationalists during the wartime period. Enormous sums of money were embezzled by the Kuomintang officials during the late 1930s, and through the 1940s, much of it being funding sent by the Americans and British to support the war effort. Most scholars agree that Chiang was not personally guilty of excessive corruption himself, but he turned a blind eye to it. Notably the huge sums of cash stolen by the former Minister of Finance and head of the Chinese Central Bank, Kung Xiangxi. Kung was married to Chiang's sister-in-law, Sung Ailing, and he was unwilling to stop he and his wife from siphoning off tens of millions of dollars into American accounts. They would later leave China after the war and live in luxury in Beverly Hills, with wealth stolen from the Chinese state during the war. Kung and Ailing were just the most glaring example of this pilfering of the government coffers. Chiang did little to stop corruption proliferating at every level within the nationalist apparatus in the 1930s and 1940s. It is widely accepted today that one of the reasons why the Chinese communists were able to build support in these years and finally emerge victorious in the Civil War was owing to public apathy about this enormous level of corruption. Because of his position as Premier of the Republic of China, and also owing to the fact that the Chinese, both the nationalists and the communists, were receiving the bulk of their military aid from the British and Americans through India and Burma, Chiang was the paramount figure when it came to diplomacy between the Chinese and the Allies during the Second World War. For instance, Chiang was the third senior-most figure at the Cairo Conference in November 1943, next to US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was not present. Here he pushed for a massive campaign into the Burma region, which would strike at the Japanese positions there and to the southeast towards Singapore, a project which would pull Japanese resources away from China and allow for American bombing of Japanese military targets within eastern China. Roosevelt was immensely supportive of the Chinese position and even agreed in principle to an injection of $1 billion of financing for the Chinese at the Egyptian conference. The Americans were also interested in the possibility of the Chinese overseeing Indochina after the war, being uncomfortable with the colonies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia returning to French colonial rule once the Japanese were defeated. This was the high watermark for Chiang's diplomacy, though. In the course of 1944, the American general in charge of the China-Burma-India theater, Joseph Stilwell, became profoundly disillusioned with Chiang and the nationalists and their corruption, believing their embezzling of money had largely caused the fall of the city of Changsha to the Japanese in June that year. Stilwell was eventually replaced, but American faith in Chiang and the nationalists withered away nonetheless. The fall of Changsha was one of the last major victories for the Japanese in China during the war. By the second half of 1944, the war had swung definitively against Germany and Japan in Europe and Asia. The American economy had now been entirely transformed and directed towards the war effort, and men, aeroplanes, tanks, ships, and armored vehicles poured into the Pacific theater every day. In the spring of 1945, the Chinese advanced into southern China towards Guangdong. The intention had been to campaign north thereafter and retake Nanjing and Shanghai in what would have been a carbon copy of the northern expedition 2 decades earlier. But before these plans were ever initiated, the United States dropped the atomic weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945, leading to Japan's surrender a few weeks later. With this, the war came to an end in China, along with the Eastern Front in Russia and Eastern Europe between 1941 and 1945. The Chinese theater had been by far and away the most deadly theater of the Second World War, with between 15 and 25 million people being killed here through combat, Japanese atrocities, and several famines between 1937 and 1945. Despite this, peace with Japan did not bring peace to China. Within weeks, both Chiang's nationalists and the communists were preparing for the descent back into the Civil War, which had only been on hiatus for as long as the Japanese occupied eastern China. By 1946, the Chinese Civil War was back in full swing. However, where the nationalists had been close to victory back in the 1930s, they were now much more evenly matched. Furthermore, while Moscow was willing to support Mao's Red Army as much as necessary, the Americans were seeking a way out of the war in the Far East and sent the Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, to China in 1946 to try to broker a peace, a sign of their wavering commitment. The nationalists were dealt a further major blow in 1947 when the administration of President Truman in Washington began drastically curtailing the amount of financial aid that it was providing to the Kuomintang, having tired of the endless corruption of Chiang's government. Chiang himself was elected as President of the Republic of China in 1948, following the promulgation of a new constitution, but within months he was threatening to resign following major military losses against the communists. The last year of the Civil War, from mid-1948 onwards, was characterized by a growing rivalry between Chiang and his vice president, Li Zhongrun, over the management of the government and the gold and dollar reserves at their disposal, even as the communists captured new towns and cities every month. When Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in April 1949, it was the beginning of the end. Thoughts now turned to the island of Taiwan. Early in 1947, an incident occurred which was to have a bearing on China's future and in particular on Chiang's legacy. It happened well away from the center of political power in the cities of eastern China. The episode occurred on the island of Formosa, better known today as Taiwan. This was a peripheral part of China, one which had been controlled for half a century between 1895 and 1945 by the Japanese. In the aftermath of the war, the Chinese government had taken it back over, and a governor, Chun Yi, was appointed to oversee the island. The local population soon became disillusioned with the Chinese administrators and the Kuomintang rule, perceiving the nationalists as being as corrupt as the Japanese had been brutal. Heavy-handed policies culminated in February 1947 in protests over the sale and supply of tobacco. This all boiled over on the 28th of February in an insurrection which was brutally suppressed by Chun Yi and the nationalist garrison, with authorization from Chiang. The death toll on the February 28th incident is a point of major contention in Taiwanese history, with some claiming that as many as 25,000 people were killed, though other modern analysts argue the figure could not have exceeded 10,000. Whatever the death toll might have been, it has colored views of Chiang's legacy in Taiwan down to the present day. The February 28 incident would not have become as central an episode in Chiang's career were it not for the fact that his life would become so entwined with the island shortly afterwards. By 1949, the situation on the mainland was desperate for Chiang and the nationalists. In January of that year, he stepped down as leader of the Kuomintang and was replaced for a time by Li Zhongrun. He remained central to military planning and in the months ahead oversaw a gradual withdrawal of nationalist forces from Nanjing, Chengdu and Chongqing and other cities and towns southwards towards Canton. Aware that they could not hope to resist the Soviet-backed communists on the mainland, Chiang and the other nationalist leaders now began preparing to evacuate the mainland and pull their forces back to the island of Hainan in the South China Sea and Taiwan, with the latter being the focus of the retreat. Chiang and the others realizing that the communists would find it difficult to take the island stronghold, particularly since the United States would aid the nationalists here and still had huge military forces stationed in the Western Pacific since the end of the Second World War. Thus, in the course of the autumn and early winter of 1949, hundreds of thousands of nationalist troops and personnel began evacuating from the mainland to Taiwan. When the trickle of individuals who had already fled here since 1946 to avoid the fighting that was taking place in China proper is taken into account, it is estimated that 2.2 million people relocated from mainland China to Taiwan between 1946 and early 1950. Having overseen this massive operation over the course of several months in late 1949, Chiang and the other leaders of the Kuomintang arrived in Taiwan and began establishing it as a rival Republic of China, even as the Communists were solidifying the People's Republic of China's hold over the mainland. The island of Hainan was overrun by them in the space of a few weeks in the late spring of 1950, ensuring that the nationalists were now confined entirely to Taiwan and some small island chains which lie around the larger island of Formosa. Taipei was established as the capital of the Republic of China on the island, and Chiang was quickly confirmed as the new president of the Republic. Such was the international situation at this stage in the Cold War that the Republic, despite being confined to the island and having lost all of the mainland, continued to be recognized by the Western powers as the legitimate Chinese authority, and the ROC, the acronym for the Republic of China, held a position at the United Nations from which the People's Republic of China was excluded for the next 20 years, a major boon to Chiang and his followers following the disastrous end to the Chinese Civil War. One of Chiang's first tasks on Taiwan was already underway from the middle of 1949, when the first steps had been taken to turn it into a nationalist stronghold. This began with the imposition of martial law and was soon expanded into a campaign to crack down on anyone who might be opposed to the new regime, especially anyone remotely connected to the communist movement. Much like the wave of anti-communist attacks launched by the Kuomintang back in 1927 during the Northern Expedition, it has come to be known as the White Terror, a campaign which technically lasted until the lifting of martial law through two measures in 1987 and 1992, but which was carried out most brutally in the early 1950s. In those early years, tens of thousands of Taiwanese people were imprisoned, while 3,000 or so were executed. Undoubtedly, some of those who were arrested and even executed were opponents of the regime, but like all such campaigns of state terror, huge numbers of people were punished excessively for only minor associations with the dissidents, while others still were entirely innocent of any crime. Many of the purges were personally commanded by Chiang against the Navy and Army, where hundreds or dozens of people were arrested at a time, ostensibly to root out communist sympathizers, though often in reality to remove any potential rivals to his rule. By the time the White Terror ended, it is believed that as many as 140,000 people spent periods imprisoned. The severity of the White Terror on Taiwan in the first years of the establishment of the nationalist government was not entirely unjustified. The communists on the mainland had not simply forgotten about the Kuomintang after Chiang led his people and armies to Taiwan in 1949. Mao and the other leaders of the People's Republic were determined to retake Taiwan, as much for the purposes of destroying a rival Chinese polity as for the actual strategic and economic value of the island itself. They had an opportunity to do so in 1949 and early 1950, at which juncture the United States probably would not have made any efforts to stop a communist invasion of Taiwan. But following the outbreak of the Korean War in the summer of 1950, and Chinese intervention in support of North Korea the following October, the US made it clear it would not look kindly on any efforts to attack Chiang's nascent nation. Nevertheless, in 1954 and again in 1958, the People's Republic began bombing some of the smaller islands in the Straits of Taiwan and seemed to be inclined to launch an invasion. On both occasions, President Dwight Eisenhower, who remains the only sitting American president to have visited Taiwan, when he did so in 1960, affirmed himself to be a staunch ally of Chiang Kai-shek, having the US Senate agree to the Formosa Resolution early in 1955, whereby US aid in defense of Taiwan should it be invaded was affirmed, while in 1954 a very direct threat was issued to Beijing that if Mao's government moved to invade, the US would consider employing its nuclear arsenal against China. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese, who would not acquire nuclear capabilities themselves until 1964, backed down. It wasn't all a one-way street when it came to plans to resume the war between the nationalists and the communists. Chiang also developed plans to invade the mainland in the 1950s and into the 1960s. One of these involved the training of elite bands of insurgents by the American CIA under the terms of the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, the plan being to send these to the mainland to operate alongside anti-communist elements there. A 1956 plan envisioned the mobilization of approximately 750,000 troops to invade the mainland, an enormous force in any other corner of the world, but perhaps nowhere near enough to invade and conquer mainland China. The most elaborate scheme was Project National Glory, or Project Guoguang, an initiative around 1960 and 1961 that aimed to take advantage of the chaos which had been unleashed across China by the Great Leap Forward, as Chairman Mao's efforts to have China become one of the most industrialized nations on Earth resulted in a catastrophic famine that killed tens of millions of people. The plan was shelved when the United States refused to sanction it following the debacle of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in April 1961. Any hopes of invading the mainland were fully abandoned from the mid-1960s, once the People's Republic acquired a nuclear arsenal. In 1954, the first presidential elections were held in Taiwan, following the flight to the island in 1949. This was not an open election, but instead just over 1,500 delegates to a National Assembly determined who would serve as president for a term of 6 years. Chiang garnered 97% of the vote, hardly surprising given the dominance of the assembly by the Kuomintang. A similar system was employed in elections in 1960, 1966 and 1972, with Chiang winning overwhelming victories on each occasion. As president, he ruled Taiwan as a military dictatorship. It came with the usual features one would expect of this. The White Terror continued in a slimmed-down manner. A secret police cracked down on open expression of political views and cultural liberalism, and the cult of personality he had first fostered on the mainland continued. But there were some advances. Aware that the excessive corruption the Kuomintang had engaged in back in the 1930s and 1940s had been substantially the cause of their losing the Civil War, Chiang attempted to reform this element of the nationalist government. Moderately socialist policies were also pursued, and a middle class was cultivated through progressive taxation. Economically, Chiang was a protectionist in the 1950s, seeking to build up indigenous industries and self-sufficiency, though that would change in time. Diplomatically, Chiang fostered relations with the United States as Taiwan's closest ally, while also seeking close ties to Japan, a country which emerged quickly from the disaster of the Second World War to become an economic powerhouse of Asia. To a much greater extent than back in China in the 1930s and 1940s, Chiang promoted a cult of personality on Taiwan from 1950 onwards. There were reasons for this. Firstly, it was, to a much greater degree, the unchallenged dictator of Taiwan after the flight to the island in 1949, whereas he had rivals for power within the nationalist movement back in China in the period from the mid-1920s to the end of the 1940s. This was also a period of growing dictatorial rule and personality cults in Asia more broadly, with figures like Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee dominating North and South Korea from the late 1940s onwards. In Taiwan, this took the form of images of Chiang in public spaces, encouragement of people to keep images of the leader in their homes, and also the erection of civic buildings in honor of Chiang and his family. This cult of personality would persist long after his death and continued to be promoted by his son and his widow. it has only gradually been dismantled in Taiwan since the 1990s. Despite Chiang's initial economic protectionism in China and in his first years of his rule over the Republic of China's island home, his quarter-century rule there saw Taiwan begin to enter into an economic miracle. In the 1960s and 1970s, the country experienced annual rates of GDP growth of nearly 10%. Much of this was driven initially by a commitment to creating small and medium-sized cooperatives that mass-produced goods that required little technological know-how or industrial capacity to make. For instance, beginning in the 1960s, Taiwan began to mass-produce umbrellas. By the 1970s, 3/4 of the world's umbrellas were made in Taiwan, and this was just one of many such products that the country cornered the market in. From there, it began to build technical expertise and use both American and Japanese financial aid and direct investment to begin developing more sophisticated products. For instance, the last years of Chiang's time as head of the Republic saw the first plants opened to manufacture semiconductors. Today, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is worth over $100 billion, and the island produces 20% of the world's supply. Earlier critics suggested that the Taiwanese economic miracle happened despite Chiang's protectionist impulses. But in 1959, his government had adopted an economic reform plan that prioritized market liberalization and foreign investment. The early 1970s brought a shift in international relations which was profoundly negative for Taiwan and the position Chiang had tried to establish for his nation on the world stage ever since 1949. Throughout the 1960s, Western countries, led by the United States, had been under growing pressure from Moscow and Beijing to recognize the primacy of the People's Republic of China at the United Nations. In 1961, the communist government was admitted to the UN, meaning there were now two nations within the organization that claimed to be the legitimate government of China. In the years that followed, several Western nations shifted their stance to recognize the People's Republic as being the de facto government of China, while many of the leading non-aligned countries in the Cold War, such as India, also pressed China's case. Then finally, in 1971, the United States shifted its stance following a visit by the American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to Beijing. As a consequence, late that year, a UN resolution effectively expelled Taiwan from its position on the Security Council and admitted China as the recognized Chinese government. Then US President Richard Nixon undertook a state visit to China in February 1972 to begin normalizing relations. In the end, the reality of the People's Republic controlling all of mainland China and the economic benefits which would accrue to the Western world by normalizing relations with Beijing proved decisive factors, and most countries withdrew official recognition of the Taiwanese government. Chiang was an aging man by the time that the Western powers began changing their diplomatic stance to acknowledge the People's Republic as the power that represented China on the world stage. Already into his 80s by the 1970s, he began to suffer from numerous ailments during these years, notably kidney problems and heart issues. A heart attack preceded his death from kidney failure and pneumonia at 87 years of age on the 5th of April 1975, over a quarter of a century after the retreat to Taiwan. A month of mourning was declared in Taiwan, both before and after his state funeral on the 16th of April. A huge tomb was created to house his remains. The Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, which is located in central Taipei next to the National Theatre. Today, a library and museum commemorating his life and the history of the Republic of China are inside the hall. He was succeeded as president by Yen Chia-kan, who served out the remainder of Chiang's 5th term. When fresh elections were held in 1978, Chiang's son from his first marriage, Chiang Ching-kuo, was elected as the new president. He gradually oversaw a loosening of Kuomintang and military rule, and is generally credited with beginning the transition to a democracy after his father's dictatorship. Chiang left behind a contested legacy. On the one hand, his life's work had ensured that an alternative version of China, one very different from the People's Republic of Mao Zedong, remained alive on Taiwan. Yet its position was weak at the time of his death, and the Western world clamored to recognize the People's Republic and in the process turned their back to some extent on their Taiwanese allies. Both China and Taiwan have changed greatly since. Mao's near successor, Deng Xiaoping, set China on a course of economic liberalization and further rapprochement with the Western world. What has developed since, through the Chinese economic miracle, is a country which remains communist in the barest sense, in reality being a capitalist state with elements of a command economy, one where an autocratic government reserves the right to intervene substantially when its interests are threatened. Taiwan has become much more democratic since Chiang's time, and despite his position as father of the nation, he is ranked poorly as a leader there on account of being a quasi-dictator. Nevertheless, while Taiwan has become a democratic nation, and China a pseudo-capitalist one since Chiang's time, the tensions between the two nations and China's desire to reincorporate what it perceives as a breakaway province have not gone away. Quite the contrary. As anyone who keeps an eye on world politics will be aware, tensions have been escalating in the Straits of Taiwan again in recent years, and China's desire to annex Taiwan will be one of the most important flashpoints in the growing rivalry. Chiang Kai-shek was one of the most important individuals in the history of modern China. For a period of half a century between his rise to the top of the Kuomintang following the death of Sun Yat-sen in the mid-1920s down to his death in 1975, he was at the forefront of the nation's politics. For exactly half of that period, he was the leader of the nationalists on the Chinese mainland, a period which saw him lead the Northern Expedition, then nearly achieve victory over the communists in the early 1930s, only to have the Japanese invasion occur from 1937 onwards, followed by the Second World War, a resumption of the Civil War in 1945, and final defeat in 1949. Few individuals live through such historic events, let alone are at the center of them continuously for several decades. The encore was a quarter of a century as head of the Republic of China on the island of Taiwan. And yet, despite being unquestionably the most significant figure in the history of modern Taiwan, his legacy there is very contentious today. This in many ways reflects his career. He was an individual of enormous ability, though fatally flawed, with the corruption and the brutality that the Kuomintang became synonymous with in the 1940s, ultimately allowing the nationalists to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in the Civil War. What do you think of Chiang Kai-shek? Was he a Chinese patriot who could have steered China on a far better course if he had led the nationalists to victory in the Civil War? Or was he a corrupt military dictator who simply looks good in retrospect by comparison with Mao Zedong? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.